Hey, MJ, and the sex expert. I believe that is part of your domain on your email address. Is that right?
I am a certified sex therapist in addition to being a betrayal trauma specialist.
In the Austin, Texas area.
I
And
recently relocated to San Marcos, so I'm just south of Austin right now.
yeah, well, being from Texas, I think of San Marcos and San Antonio, and all, kind of all almost like the Metroplex in Dallas, which is where I am. But beautiful area down there. You have a great area to live in. And so we've been talking. We're certainly going to be sure that we include all of her credentials because you will be so impressed when you look at it and you will just go like, Cheryl, how did you get her to spend time with you? But she's doing this for you guys, our listeners and viewers. So we've got a series talking about betrayal trauma and why it's an important part to understand. In my opinion, it's part of a forgiveness coaching and a forgiveness series that I do and that I think is very important for us to really understand the physiology and to honor ourselves for what we've been through and honor our bodies. They're really very amazing machines, aren't they, MJ? And the more you talk, the more I marvel again. The Lord tells us that we're fearfully and wonderfully made. So we're talking about betrayal trauma in context of a marriage. And so let's just pick back up again. We've talked a little bit about attachment. And one of the things that I sort of break it, my story into three different stages. Getting a clue. We've talked about that shock and awe moment, what
When
happened.
you had discovery of betrayal.
Discovery.
Yeah.
That's right. When I had discovery. And then I just call the next part like walking through the break, and there was still a lot of discovery that went on during that time. But we talked some, MJ, about some of the other things that I was going through that were still very physiological. And one of the things I want to be sure that we talk about is, I was having panic attacks at night, and I didn't know that's what they were at the time. I actually got some Xanax from my doctor. And during this time between getting the clue and I want to reiterate that my former husband in my situation never did admit to me that there was another woman. I found that out through hiring a private investigator. And once he filed, he found out what I knew when he got discovery. But I want to point out that in my situation, and I know you deal with really across a spectrum of different scenarios, but in my case, there was one other woman. She's they've been married now for 18 years, and so this was my situation. But at that point, I didn't know that. We began to uncover. So I want to talk about a little bit some of the things that I began to go through. A couple of them, again, those panic attacks that I was having at night, and again, I didn't really know what was happening. The heart rate, the can't sleep, the losing the weight. And I'm looking, and I hadn't done anything wrong. I was the innocent party as much as anybody can be innocent and still be a living human being. Not saying I was totally innocent, but in this particular category, I was innocent. And the perpetrator is sleeping just fine and going on about business, and nothing has changed. And I'm having all these physiological things happening. From your expert knowledge and perspective, can you speak a little bit to that? What was going on?
Let's talk first, Cheryl, about your panic attacks. Panic attacks, what that means is the amygdala, the part of the brain that detects danger, has been activated. The amygdala, for some reason, and there is always a reason, even if we are not conscious of what that reason is, the amygdala perceives danger. And when that happens, the amygdala kicks into some kind of survival mechanism. right? So we may either fight to try to survive this moment of danger. We might flight. We might try to run, either emotionally or physically. There's some kind of disconnection process where we are trying to get away from the danger. We might freeze, where we become immobile to some extent to survive the danger. Now, panic attacks happen. The amygdala is perceiving danger and says in this very dramatic way, I am going to die.
Mm.
It is that dramatic. Even if we are not dramatic people, the amygdala perceives death. And
Wow.
so
That's
it,
a lot.
that is a lot. People who have never had panic attacks before sometimes will have panic attacks after experiencing betrayal. And a panic attack in and of itself, though it is a response to trauma and sometimes betrayal, every single panic attack in and of itself is another traumatic event. Because when the body goes into this physiological response, some people will experience a panic attack. They feel like an elephant is sitting on their chest and they can't breathe, right? And that scares them and they go, oh my gosh, am I having a heart attack? Because it can feel very similar. They're not. They might be having heartache, but it feels like a heart attack. And now the amygdala, who's already having a response to attachment distress, betrayal, trauma, now has this panic attack, and that is now registering as its own traumatic event. The person might experience, we call it derealization. It can be where when this panic attack happens, they feel they don't know what's real. They feel disconnected. It's a form of dissociation. So I know I'm throwing many big words out here to our listeners. Dissociation is when our brain basically checks out. The brain says, too much. I'm going over here. I'm checking out. But when we dissociate, it can feel, you'll hear people say sometimes, I feel crazy. Am I crazy? I feel crazy. No, probably not crazy. It feels like we're crazy because reality becomes surreal. We don't feel like we have our feet on the ground. And so it feels so strange and unreal, surreal. You mentioned you had panic attacks at night.
Mm.
This is really important, Cheryl, for us to talk to our listeners about. When we are sleeping, our brain makes movies, so to speak. We dream, and what's happening? Our brain is making movies filled with symbols of the things we are wrestling with emotionally, the things we are thinking about, and it's the brain's way of processing our experiences. Well, what can happen in this brain's attempt to make sense out of what we experience? The movies that our brain makes can actually trigger our amygdala. So, right, get this, our brain's trying to work it out, but if it's what it's working out, now activates our amygdala, and our amygdala goes, danger, while we're sleeping. We're going to get a blast of adrenaline, and the next thing you know, the person wakes up from a sound sleep and their heart is racing and they're heated up, right? Everything's hot and they feel like they have an elephant sitting on their chest and they think they might die. And what just happened? And they wake up having a panic attack.
Yeah.
And then go, what's wrong with me? What's happening? I'm so scared and confused. And right, what's wrong with me? And that's a human thing. What's wrong with me? We often do that way before we go, wait a minute, what's wrong with you? We'll go, what's wrong with me first?
Especially women. I'm going to say that. I'm not going to ask you to make it.
Maybe, well, I was going to say maybe, and especially children. Kids will very often, when something happens with parents, kids will often say, what's wrong with me? You know, did I cause my parents to fight or whatever? So in some ways we're big kids. So maybe that's a human experience, right? For us to, what's wrong with me?
Yeah.
So I want to, though it was, I make up, it was really hard for you, Cheryl, when you were walking through this, what you said, I'm walking through the break. your world just blew up. It was catastrophic. Your husband uh, didn't want to be married anymore, and he wanted to see other people. And you found out there was somebody else he was seeing. And your sense of security and safety literally blew up, right? The world was no longer safe. I bet everything felt dangerous. And you were trying to discern, who do I tell? Do I tell anyone? As you had all of those emotions, fear, overwhelm, sadness, anger, et cetera, et cetera. And you go to sleep for moments hoping for rest, and then you experience this trauma symptom of sleep disruptions, right? For some people, they struggle to get to sleep. For some people, they struggle to stay asleep. For some people, they struggle to get back to sleep after they wake up. For some people, everything, their body is exhausted from all the adrenaline, and yet they cannot sleep because of all the adrenaline. And then you had panic attacks, and which makes sense, right? Your amygdala was perceiving danger. And then you wake up and you look over, and here's this man sleeping next to you, and maybe he's snoring. And you might think, why am I having all of this? And he seems to be fine. Like, is he fine? He seems to be fine. Is that what happened to you?
Yes, very much. Again, having the faith background too, like, I'm not guilty and you're guilty. Like, why are you not feeling any guilt? Why? And I think that was a really hard thing for me to understand. How can you, it seemed almost like there was a separation of you were talking about a while ago, disassociation. That almost seemed like what was happening with him, that he had another life or something, and I couldn't understand it. Do you see that, or do you?
Well, so sometimes I'll name this, dissociation happens to 100% of humans. We actually begin dissociating in infancy, when we are being raised by caregivers, whoever they are. If they have a mean face, if they yell, life is happening. But for an infant, we cannot fight because we're a baby, and we cannot flight. Where are we going to go? We're a baby. And so we learn how to freeze. We learn how to dissociate as infants to basically survive a moment that is emotionally overwhelming and threatens our sense of safety, real or perceived. It is irrelevant. If our brain feels like, if the amygdala says this is danger, we have to survive that moment. And so we little humans dissociate, we disconnect from this overwhelming, scary thing. That form of coping follows us into adulthood and can happen until our last day on the planet. So let's take that experience of dissociation and go to, if a human has been unfaithful, if they had a commitment to honor their person and then they did not, that for that person, even though they chose it, even though they did a series of behaviors in which that happened, they might also have a value system in which they don't really condone or believe in betrayal. And so when we have a value system and our behaviors don't line up with our own value system, how does a person cope with that? Well, they might dissociate. They might disconnect from how they feel, because if they sat in that emotional place of, I love this woman, I committed to honor her until our last days, and now I did this thing over here and I betrayed her. It's too hard, and that person may cope through dissociation, conscious or not. They might disconnect.
Yeah.
The other part has to do, you and I have mentioned this, though betrayal can happen to men and women, it's not gender specific. You and I talked about the male brain, the female brain. With men, they tend to have a hormone, testosterone, women have testosterone too, but men tend to have more. And testosterone is a chemical that helps the brain to compartmentalize, right?
Okay.
Both genders have um, estrogen, and estrogen is a chemical that can help people with their emotional experience. So we humans, we generalize and we say, oh, men, they compartmentalize more. Women, they are more emotional. Now we know men and women both compartmentalize and are emotional creatures. In this case, that testosterone may have helped your husband compartmentalize what was happening in his life, especially if he was doing behaviors that actually didn't even line up with his own value system.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
And then add in some dissociation where I can't really think about it or feel it. I need to put it to the side so that I don't sit in. I'm doing something that doesn't actually line up with how I had committed to honor this lady.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That brings up something else that I really want to be sure that you talk about, because I've heard you talk about this, MJ, and you handle it so well. And that's that up and down, and it seeming like those hormones are coming and going, and the fight, the flight, the flight, or the freeze, and I think as we're going through this, again, speaking to women, mostly of faith, we're feeling a lot of judgment on ourselves of like, why am I blowing up and cussing and throwing things, and that goes against everything in my value system. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on physiologically there?
Absolutely. We humans will say and do things in moments in which we are feeling threatened, in which we are perceiving danger, right? In those moments of survival, our brain, right? The amygdala is detecting danger. We're getting blasted with adrenaline, heart rate, breathing changes, digestive tract distress, right? Everything's moving and our frontal lobe is impacted. We cannot think critically as we would when we are not in that experience. We struggle to have impulse control. Or we might have some, but we might not have much. And in that place of distress and survival, humans they're at risk of saying and doing things that they might not ever do ever in their entire life. And so if you add in this combination of betrayal, my person has just betrayed me. Bam, I have attachment distress. My person has just left me. Combined with a primal panic. I don't know if I'm going to survive. What is happening? The cacophony of emotions, anger, sadness, confusion, shame, 15 different things at once. And then people will find themselves doing behaviors that don't even line up with their value system. I've heard so many women, I'm thinking of, some of my ladies who are like, I have a faith base. I have a set of behaviors that I do and I don't do. I try to leave this life that is like a moral-based, values-based life. And then they say, and I have words come out of my mouth that I never say. I swung, I had violence, I was out of my mind. I've heard of women going to jail because they were out of control in that moment. And then when their nervous system comes back down and they regulate, now they have that traumatic experience of, what did I just do? It's something I never, ever would have seen myself doing. And it's really confusing to people.
It really is. And it reminds me of a story that happened. It was very well known in the news several years after my situation, but I was like, that explains it. So you may remember the woman that was an astronaut that found out that I don't even think this was her husband. I think it was her boyfriend was cheating with someone else, and she put on a diaper, one of those Depends, and drove halfway across the country. Do you
Yes,
remember that
I
story?
do remember that.
So I remember hearing that story and have, I had been through, I had a little bit of understanding, but normally had I not been through that, I would think this woman is an astronaut. My gosh, she's a scientist. She's logical. If you could control yourself to get in a spaceship and be hurtled by a bunch of fire into the air, surely you could control yourself. Isn't that a perfect example
Yes.
of that?
Sometimes people are in such distress that they will do behaviors that don't make sense to themselves or anyone else. It's not their normal, but that can happen. And so, Cheryl, we're talking about this here because we want our listeners to understand if they've experienced behaviors that are not their normal, that don't make sense to them. We're trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together for
Yeah.
them to say, if these things were happening in your brain, if you were biologically having these experiences, those are the contributing factors to why you might have had words or behaviors that maybe have never happened before and maybe have never happened since, to make sense out of why did that happen.
Yes, I'm so glad I think you speak to that so well, MJ, because I think there can be a lot of guilt, and shame. Like, how could I act so stupid? And I think that as we talked about my story and having that window of time, as I was trying to protect my mom who was terminally ill, I think I got a new level of ability to access that cognitive function, that executive function.
Yeah.
Because I had, that conflicting value system or desire or goal in mind. But the reason I want to say that is because I feel like I did have time to work through a lot of that before he filed, before it became public in our small town. I was meeting, just to go back a little bit to my story, but as head of the women's ministry, I was meeting with my pastor and his wife weekly, because I was trying to protect my mom and dad, and I did not want them to know. And so meeting with them, on a regular basis helped me mentally prepare so that when I did file and I was in front of people, I will say that I feel like I handled it pretty well because I'd already had those weeks of being alone and working through a lot of these things by myself. Now, we still had a lot, 4 more months to go before the divorce was final. So there's still a lot of walking through that we will talk about in another part of our series. But I really want to be sure that we again honor our listeners. And if you've been through this, I just want to say, damn, you're amazing. You are amazing, and your body was designed to protect you. And so, kudos to our body and to our makeup. The scripture tells us that we're fearfully and wonderfully made. And everything you've just shared is just more and more evidence of how precious our body is. And a lot of those things, it was keeping us alive, wasn't it? Can you say that?
Well, and I was thinking, Cheryl, that how people behave when they are in trauma is often not a reflection of our character.
Mm.
It is a reflection of our human desire to stay alive, right? It's a primal panic. Our brains and our bodies will do things. It doesn't, if we have poor behavior in that traumatized place, we're still responsible for it. We still have to be accountable for it, right? It's not a pass. But and sometimes, we have consequences for it. Yet, even though that is true, that we have to be accountable and responsible for what happens when we are in a traumatic event, in a trauma response, I want to take some of that guilt and shame off of our listeners if that happened, to say it's not reflective of a character defect, of a poor character. It is a response. That is a human response to trauma. That's what happened.
Yes, and even what you just said, I think there may be other people in our life. Maybe someone's listening that this is going to explain their mother. This is going to explain a snapshot of their life that they didn't understand. And so our goal here is to help you appreciate where you are and move on. The end of the story is a good one. God has a wonderful life for you still, and nobody can take that from you. But you need to honor yourself for what you've been through. And if you know someone, I want to encourage you, if you know someone right now that either is going through that or has just gone through it, or maybe they went through it 10 years ago, and maybe you can look back and go, I didn't really honor that person, or I didn't understand. Pick up the phone, send a text, send an email, message them through Facebook, let them know, like, I'm sorry, I didn't understand, and I ask you to forgive me for what I said or did, because I know that it's easy to do that. I did that myself before all this happened. Like, well, how could you do that, to a person that was maybe the innocent party? Again,
Cheryl, you are naming, we don't know until we know.
That's right. That's right. That's so
And I
true.
heard somebody say to me, but when we know better, I hope we do better.
True.
Me too.
And forgiveness, as it sets us free. And so we can set somebody else free when we give them that forgiveness. And in this moment, I just want to bring that back to what we've been talking about, just loving on people that are going through those traumas, and not being dismissive. Oh, well, rejoice always. And again, I say rejoice. God works everything out for good. And all those things are true. But sometimes our friends or ourselves are in a trauma situation where we need
They're surviving.
We need to know. That's right. That other scripture that says, mourn with those that mourn, and we, rejoice with those that rejoice. MJ, this has been this one has really been a great discussion. I think it's so important. And as you always bring so much calmness and understanding and empathy to the discussions that we've had. So I just want to thank you for that.
Thank you for allowing me this time to be with you and your listeners. And, my hope is that we can help others.
Good.
And I think we're doing that. I hope we're doing that.
That's what we want to do, because lots of life out there, lots of wisdom out there. We still want to give it. I'll just wrap that up to say, I always said I did not want to be the hag in the corner that my children did not want to be around. And we can probably all say we know some of those people, So
maybe what you're saying when you say that is, maybe you didn't want to have bitterness or resentment. Maybe that's what you mean when you say, I don't want to be the hag. I don't want to be bitter and resentful. Maybe you wanted to move through that to get to maybe peace or calm. Does that fit?
Exactly. Another part of the story that maybe we can go into another time was that my father-in-law had done the same thing. 20 years of marriage, where my husband did it at 30 years of marriage. So I had lived through it as the daughter-in-law. I'd seen what we had to go through as the three sons and the spouses. So yes. I already knew what was coming for my children. And that was another thing that was, traumatizing for me, to know that they were going to have to go through that. But and they're all sons, and usually, girls are closer to their mothers. And I thought, okay, if I'm not careful here, I'm going to be the one that's left out, and not have my children around, because
Yeah.
I just remembered those things. And so, yeah, I really did not want to be the hag in the corner that nobody was like, oh my gosh, do we have to invite her to the party this year? You know, do we have to have her over? Cause she's just a Debbie Downer. And I'm just not that way. And I didn't want this to change me in that way.
It sounds like you had real determination to do some healing, to move through this in some way so that you wouldn't end up in, like, you had an idea of what it could look like in a way that you didn't want it to be. And so
Yeah,
you're trying to take steps to make sure that doesn't happen.
that's right. And it's possible, isn't it?
It is. I'm thinking of one lady who came to see me early on in my counseling career, and she said, I've experienced betrayal. My person betrayed me. We reconciled. He betrayed me again. We reconciled and he betrayed me again. And she said, I'm here because I don't want to be bitter and angry.
Mhm.
I need to heal so that I'm not that lady. That was her motivating force.